Hey guys, hope you're all tucked in, maybe with your blanket pulled just right and the light dimmed low. Tonight, we're going to drift back, far back, to a strange and quiet time. After one of the most terrifying chapters in human history, the Black Death had finally ended, or, at least, mostly ended. Imagine the world around the late 1350s. The air felt oddly clean and still. The endless tolling of church bells had faded. Those grim carts full of bodies were gone, and for the first time in years, you could hear birds again. It was as if the whole world had taken a long, painful breath, and was now sitting there, a little dazed, wondering what to do next. The Black Death, that massive wave of plague that swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, had killed anywhere between a third and half of the population. No one knew exactly how many. People didn't count the dead in neat columns back then. They just buried, and wept, and tried to keep breathing. But now, here we are, after the storm. What does a world do when it loses almost half its people? What happens when the fields are empty, the streets too quiet, and everyone left behind has seen more death than life? Let's imagine walking through a little English village, around 1353. The sun is setting, that soft, golden kind of light that turns the thatch roofs to honey. You can hear a cow lowing somewhere far off, one of the few that survived, and the smell of smoke curls from a few chimneys again. Life, somehow, is trying to come back, but everything looks different now. The weeds have grown wild over the churchyard walls. Half the cottages stand empty. In one, the door swings gently in the wind. No one's been inside for years. There's a wooden bowl still sitting on the table, a small child's shoe by the hearth, and dust thick as flour on everything. People avoided those houses, memories, ghosts, that sort of thing. Across Europe, villages had simply vanished. Abandoned farms, entire fields left to the wind. In England alone, they say around 1,000 villages disappeared completely in the years after the plague. Just gone. Nature crept back in. Wildflowers where wheat once grew, foxes nesting in barns, trees pushing up through old floorboards. But for those who did survive, well, things were about to change. See, before the Black Death, most people in Europe lived under a pretty strict system, feudalism. If you were a peasant, or as they sometimes called it, a serf, you worked the land for a lord. The lord owned pretty much everything, the fields, the mill, even your labor. You couldn't just leave and go work somewhere else, even if you wanted to. It was a world of know your place and don't ask questions. But now, half the peasants were gone, and suddenly, every lord, every monastery, every manor was desperate for workers. Fields were empty. Sheep wandered about unshared, harvests rotted. And that, my sleepy friend, gave the survivors a strange kind of power. Imagine you're one of those surviving farmhands. You've just lived through a nightmare. The plague took your family, your friends, half the village. You've seen enough to last 10 lifetimes, but you're alive. You can still swing a scythe, still plant, still plow. Now your old lord wants you back in the fields. But wait, so does the lord in the next village, and the one beyond him too. Everyone's desperate for help. So you, my tired medieval survivor, can name your price. And people did. Wages went up. Peasants started bargaining. You want me to harvest your wheat? Fine, but I want food, good wages, and a cottage with a roof that doesn't leak. And for a while, it worked. Across much of Western Europe, wages climbed. Laborers were in short supply, and suddenly, their work mattered. Of course, the rich didn't like this one bit. In England, King Edward III tried to stop it. In 1351, he passed something called the Statute of Labourers. It basically said, no, you peasants can't just demand more money. You have to work for the same wages as before the plague. You can probably imagine how that went over. People ignored it. Lords tried to enforce it. But honestly, when half your village is gone, who's going to plough the field if the labourers walk away? You can't yell at the cows to do it. And so, despite laws and punishments, people kept asking for, and getting better pay and better treatment. For the first time in centuries, the lower classes had a little leverage. That shift would echo for generations. You could even say the Black Death helped crack open the old feudal system, making way for new ideas of freedom, labor, and rights. But it wasn't all opportunity and sunshine. Far from it, because while the living tried to rebuild, fear still lingered, thick as mist. People believed the plague might come back at any moment, and well, It did, in smaller waves, again and again through the 14th and 15th centuries. Each time it came, it reminded everyone that death was never far away. So they prayed, a lot. Churches filled again, but something subtle had shifted there too. Many people had lost faith in the old institutions. The church had been powerful, yes, but during the plague, priests and bishops had died just like everyone else. Some ran away, some demanded money for last rites, some monasteries shut their doors entirely. People started to wonder, if even the holiest can fall, what does that mean? And that quiet doubt, that whisper of disillusionment, would ripple through Europe for centuries to come. You can trace a faint line from that doubt all the way to the Reformation 200 years later. But right now, in the quiet 1350s, people weren't thinking about big revolutions. They were just trying to live. Imagine a market day, a small town square, muddy underfoot, the smell of fish and hay and wood smoke. A few traders have set up stalls again. There's laughter, a bit cautious, but real. Someone's selling onions, someone else has wool. Children play, chasing a stick through the puddles. For a moment, it almost feels normal again. People talk about who survived, who didn't, about the priest who's still coughing, about the farm down the road that's been empty since the spring, and they wonder, maybe this is it. Maybe the world is finally healing. But in the evenings, when the fires burn low and the night settles in, there's still that soundless hush, the memory of all that loss. It's strange how silence can feel louder than noise sometimes. Pause, soft, sleepy tone, and that's where we'll rest our thoughts for a moment, right on the edge of a world trying to find itself again. Because as we'll see, after the Black Death ended, Europe didn't just rebuild, it transformed in ways no one at the time could have imagined. But for now, let's take a slow breath. The fields are green again, the bells ring less often, and somewhere, under the same stars, life begins to stir. So where were we? Ah yes, the world is breathing again. Smoke from a few chimneys curls lazily into a pale morning sky. A rooster crows, though it sounds a bit hoarse, as if even it's tired from all the recent years. The Black Death has passed, or at least slipped away for now, and life is returning. Cautiously, like a cat peeking out from under a bed after a thunderstorm. You can almost feel that mixture of relief and unease in the air. People are happy to be alive, of course, but everything feels different. The fields, the towns, the churches, even the way the sunlight falls on the ground, as though the world itself has changed shape slightly. And in a way, it had. The survivors were walking through a quieter, emptier world. The familiar sounds, chatter, bells, footsteps were fewer. In the city's whole neighborhoods stood hollow. The smell of rot and smoke lingered in the corners. Rats scurried over piles of stones that used to be homes. The air carried a faint sour temps from the lime pits where bodies had once been buried. But people, being people, began to fill that silence again, with hammers, and laughter, and prayers. In Florence, where the plague had struck with terrifying fury, something remarkable started to happen. Artists, thinkers, and merchants began to look at the world differently. It wasn't overnight, of course. For a while, everyone just tried to survive. But as the years passed, a sort of restless energy began to hum beneath the surface. Because when half the world dies, it makes you think about death, sure, but also about life. About what matters, what's beautiful, what's worth remembering. That's where art started to shift. Before the plague, much of medieval art was religious, solemn saints, golden halos, flat faces staring out from painted wood panels. But after the Black Death, you start to see something else creep in. Suddenly, paintings show sorrow, fragility, the ache of being human. Artists painted death itself, skeletons dancing among the living. A grim little reminder called the Dance of Death. It wasn't cheerful, but it was honest. There was a kind of strange comfort in it. Actually, if death could come for anyone, then maybe the rich and powerful weren't as untouchable as they seemed. Maybe everyone was equal, at least in the end. And yet, out of that darkness, light also grew. People wanted to capture beauty again. They painted gardens, lovers, families, faces full of real emotion. They built chapels that shimmered with color and gold, as if to say, yes, death is always near. But look, life still glows. You can almost imagine walking through Florence in the 1360s. The plague memories still linger, but there's laughter spilling from the workshops again. A young painter, maybe someone like Giotto's students, mixes pigments in a bowl. Ochre, cinnabar, lapis lazuli ground into powder, the air smelling faintly of vinegar and dust. Through the open window, you hear merchants haggling in the street, horses clopping over cobblestones, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of church bells. It's not peace exactly, but it's motion, and that's something. Meanwhile, the church itself was wobbling. During the plague, so many priests had died that some villages had no one left to perform last rites, or even lead Sunday Mass. New, inexperienced clergy had to be rushed in, often young men barely trained. The old confidence of the church began to crack a little. People still prayed, of course. They still built chapels and lit candles, but in their hearts, some started asking quiet, dangerous questions. If God had allowed this, why? If the priests couldn't save them, what good were they really? It wasn't rebellion yet, that would come later, but it was the beginning of a slow awakening. In England, one preacher named John Wycliffe began saying things no one was supposed to say aloud. He claimed the church was too rich, too corrupt, too far from the Bible. He wanted ordinary people to be able to read the scriptures in their own language, not Latin. And people listened. Because after seeing so much death, the pomp and ceremony of bishops in silk didn't feel very holy anymore. You can picture a weary farmer standing in a field, leaning on his hoe, listening to the preacher's words and thinking, maybe he's right. And that seed, that small, dangerous idea, would grow over the next 100 years into something called the Reformation. But for now, it's just a murmur in the wind. Across the countryside, daily life had taken on a strange rhythm. With fewer mouths to feed, there was suddenly more land and food for those who survived. Meat and bread became more common on tables that used to see only thin soup. Peasants wore better clothes. Sometimes even wool dyed in soft colors, a small luxury once reserved for the wealthy. It must have felt almost guilty at times to be better off after so much loss. There's a record from an English manor in the 1360s showing that peasants who once paid rent in labor, plowing, sowing, harvesting, now paid in money instead. That's a quiet revolution, right there. People were no longer bound entirely to the land. They could save, trade, move, choose. You can almost hear the whisper of it, a kind of new independence rustling through the fields like wind through barley. But of course, not everyone liked this new world. The old nobility, who once commanded armies of obedient peasants, now found themselves struggling. Their wealth depended on land and labor, and both were slipping out of their hands. So they tightened their grip where they could, raised taxes, passed more laws to freeze wages, tried to push everyone back into the way things were, and that, as you can guess, led to anger. In England, by the 1380s, the tension had built up like steam in a kettle, and one hot summer, it boiled over. Peasants marched to London in what became known as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. They came from Kent, from Essex, from small towns and fields, thousands of them, carrying sticks, scythes, whatever they had. They weren't just angry about taxes, they were angry about everything, the unfairness, the laws, the old order that wouldn't let them breathe. Imagine the sight, a sea of people moving slowly up the road, toward the capital, singing rough songs, the dust rising around their feet. At their head, a man named Wat Tyler Strong, plain-spoken, probably very tired of being told what to do. They reached London. For a moment, it seemed like the whole kingdom might change, but the revolt ended, as most revolts do, with blood. Tyler was killed. The leaders were hunted down, and yet, something had shifted. The peasants went back to their fields, but they carried a new thought with them. We can stand up. And though it would take centuries more, that quiet thought whispered from one generation to the next would slowly change the balance of power forever. The world was learning that even after devastation, life doesn't just return, it evolves. The fire crackles low now. The stars have come out over the dark countryside. Somewhere, an owl calls that slow, hollow sound that feels older than time. And you can almost sense Europe, this weary continent, settling into its new shape. Fewer people, yes, but more freedom. More empty houses, but also more space to dream. Tomorrow, we'll wander through what came next. How cities grew strange and colorful again. How love, money, and curiosity began to reshape everything. But for now, just imagine that soft wind drifting over the silent fields, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, and the murmur of change. So, the night passes. Imagine dawn, slow and gentle, spreading over a city like Florence or London in the decades after the plague. a pale wash of pink across the rooftops, smoke curling up from a few chimneys, the faint sound of a bell calling sleepy souls to prayer. The city is smaller than it used to be, quieter, but not dead, just reborn in a different shape. Cobblestones glisten from a night of mist. The smell of bread drifts from a bakery where the new apprentices still fumble with the dough. You can hear horses snorting in the cold, a cart creaking somewhere, pigeons cooing from the rafters of a church. It's all so normal, so ordinary, and yet, to those who remember the silence of the plague years, it must have felt like a miracle. This was the Europe of the late 1300s, a continent that had been broken and was slowly, quietly, rebuilding itself from the ashes. And oddly enough, all that emptiness, all that loss, left room for something new to grow. Because with so many people gone, things that were once scarce became plentiful. There were more houses than tenants, more land than farmers, more tools than hands to use them. The survivors found themselves surrounded by opportunity. In towns, merchants began buying up those empty houses, turning them into workshops and storehouses. In the countryside, some peasants leased whole farms instead of just a few acres. Families who'd once been poor suddenly had choices they never imagined. And that sense of choice, of possibility, was the spark of something big. In Italy, especially, you could feel the hum of change. The great cities of Florence, Venice, Genoa, all built on trade and cleverness, were ready to rise again. The plague had shaken them hard, but trade routes never stay empty for long. Ships still crossed the Mediterranean, sails snapping in the wind, carrying spices, silk, and strange stories from the East. And wherever there are ships and coins, there's curiosity. Merchants who'd seen half their friends buried began thinking differently about life. They didn't just want to survive, they wanted to build, to enjoy, to leave something behind. You could say they developed a taste for legacy. That is how you get the early stirrings of what we'd one day called the Renaissance. Of course, no one in 1360 said, "Ah yes, let's start the Renaissance today." It just sort of happened, slowly, like the morning fog lifting off the Arno River. Painters began experimenting with depth, with light, with making people look real instead of holy. Think of artists like Giotto and later, Masaccio, men who dared to paint saints with tired eyes and shadows under their chins. Sculptors began to carve bodies that looked human again, muscles, skin, veins, as if saying, "Look, this is what life looks like. Isn't it amazing?" It wasn't just art. Scholars started dusting off old Greek and Roman texts, things that had sat forgotten in monasteries for centuries. They read about geometry, philosophy, medicine, and wondered, why did we stop thinking like this? You can picture a scholar in Florence, around 1375, hunched over a candlelit desk, reading a crumbling Latin scroll, while outside, the bells toll the hour. The candle flickers, the air smells of wax and parchment, and he whispers to himself words no one's spoken in 1,000 years. This was the quiet beginning of humanism, the idea that human beings, not just divine forces, could shape their own world. And all of that, this revival of art, science, and curiosity, started growing from a Europe that had just survived its darkest days. It's strange, isn't it? Sometimes, when the world falls apart, that's exactly when people start rebuilding it better. Now, not everyone became a philosopher or painter, of course. Most people still worked hard, still plowed, still baked, still worried about taxes and the weather. But even in the humblest cottages, things were changing in small, almost invisible ways. For one, people were cleaner. That sounds funny, doesn't it? But after the plague, cities began to care more about hygiene, at least, a medieval version of it. Towns started building better drainage ditches, cleaning streets, and banning pigs from wandering through the marketplace, which, honestly, was probably a good move. And in places like Venice, where disease had entered by ship, officials invented something brand new: quarantine. The word comes from 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. That's how long ships had to wait before anyone could go ashore. If you were unlucky enough to be a sailor stuck on one of those boats, you'd sit out there in the lagoon for over a month, just watching the city's golden domes shimmer in the distance. The smell of salt and tar in your nose, the sound of gulls overhead, the waiting, endless waiting. But it worked. It saved lives. That idea that you could stop disease by isolating it would shape medicine for centuries. Medicine itself was changing too. During the plague, doctors had relied on wild theories: bad air, planetary misalignment, or humors out of balance. But now, some began to question that. They started observing, recording, testing. It wasn't modern science yet, but you can see the first glimmers of it, small lights flickering in the darkness. And of course, people's relationship with death changed too. It wasn't hidden anymore. It wasn't a faraway thing that happened to other people. Everyone had faced it, up close. And because of that, people began to think more deeply about what it meant to live. You see it in their wills, suddenly, full of detail and generosity. People left money to hospitals, to schools, to churches, but also to friends and neighbors, to build fountains or repair bridges. They wanted to be remembered, not just for being rich or noble, but for doing something good. Even funerals became more personal. In some cities, people started adding portraits to their tombs, faces that looked like them, not idealized saints. A quiet wish to say, "I was here." And in that wish, you can sense something profoundly human, a small rebellion against the vast, indifferent sweep of history. Meanwhile, trade was buzzing again. Ships left Italian ports full of cloth and came back with spices and stories. The Hanseatic League, a network of merchant towns in northern Europe, tied together cities like Hamburg, Lübeck, and Bruges in a web of commerce. The smell of tarred ropes, wet wood, and salt filled the harbors again. Markets bustled with noise, coins clinking, pigs squealing, the chatter of 10 languages at once. Europe was waking up, stretching its arms, and realizing it still had business to do. But deep underneath all that movement, there was still a kind of melancholy, a memory of what had been lost. You could feel it in the songs, those slow, mournful ballads about lost loves and vanished towns. Even the laughter at taverns seemed softer, as if people were afraid to laugh too loudly in case death heard and came knocking again. And yet, life continued, because it always does. Somewhere, in a small workshop, a blacksmith hammers out a horseshoe, sparks flying like fireflies. A mother hums to her child while stirring a pot of barley stew. A monk writes a sermon in a cold stone room, his breath fogging the air. All small moments, but together, they rebuild a world. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the slow rhythm of recovery, the pulse of human life, finding its beat again after the silence. So, as the sun sets on our imaginary 14th century evening, the air smells faintly of rain and ash, and the distant hum of city life carries over the rooftops. The plague had taken so much, but from its shadow rose new ideas about art, about learning, about what it meant to be alive at all. And in the next quiet stretch of our story, we'll wander into that slow bloom, into how love, beauty, and a hunger for knowledge began to shape a brand new Europe, one painting, one song, one whispered idea at a time. So, where were we? Ah, yes, Europe. Still half dreaming, half waking, in the century after the plague. The bells are ringing again, faint but steady. A baker yawns as he stokes his fire, the smell of warm bread mingling with the damp scent of early morning stone. Life, delicate and uneven, continues. The people who survived the Black Death were different from the ones who came before. You can almost feel it in their bones. The old ways, the unquestioned obedience, the blind faith, the fixed hierarchies, didn't fit as neatly anymore. Too much had changed, too much had been lost. Families, for one, were smaller. Sometimes entire generations had vanished, leaving only a single child, or an aunt, or a distant cousin to carry on the family name. But those small families began to build new kinds of households. Before the plague, villages were tightly woven, big families, neighbors everywhere, shared tools, shared gossip. After, the web had holes in it. You might live next to an empty cottage, or farmland that used to belong to someone whose name was only whispered now. And that loneliness did something strange. It made people value closeness more. Marriage became less about family alliances, and more about companionship, or at least, about survival together. You see records from the late 14th century showing widows remarrying, widowers finding new partners quickly. Life was fragile, and people didn't want to be alone. You can imagine two survivors, maybe both having lost their families, meeting at a market. Maybe she's selling eggs, he's buying grain. They talk softly about the weather, about prices, about nothing important. But behind every word is that silent understanding: we made it. The need for stability drew people together, even as the world around them kept shifting. And speaking of shifting, something was happening with women, too. Before the plague, Most women's roles were tightly bound to home, church, and field. But after the Black Death, with so many men gone, women began to fill spaces they hadn't before. They ran workshops, managed estates, and worked trades once closed to them. In England, for example, widows of craftsmen often took over their husbands' businesses. A woman might suddenly be the town's official baker or weaver, her name entered into guild records. In some places, they earned good money and even joined merchant circles. Now, it wasn't a grand feminist revolution. Society was still very much male-dominated, but the cracks were forming, quietly, steadily. You can almost see them, a woman in a rough wool dress, sleeves rolled up, sweeping flour off her apron as she counts coins by candlelight. Her children asleep upstairs, the night still and full of possibility. In a strange way, the Black Death had pushed people, men and women alike, to become more self-reliant. When half your neighbors are gone, you learn to mend your own fences, bake your own bread, and make do with what you have. That spirit of independence, of personal responsibility, began to shape the culture. People started to think of themselves less as part of a rigid order and more as individuals. Tiny sparks of the modern world, glowing faintly in the ashes of the old. Now, as Europe grew quieter and more thoughtful, the economy was also shifting in curious ways. With fewer workers, wages stayed high. But as the decades passed, populations began to creep up again. By the early 1400s, babies were being born in greater numbers. The fields grew busy once more. But this time, people remembered what scarcity had felt like, and they weren't so quick to give up their newfound freedoms. And all this rebuilding brought another thing back. Culture, music for instance, began to change. Before the plague, much of it was sacred chants, hymns, songs to keep your mind on heaven. But after, something softer appeared. Love songs, folk ballads, songs about ordinary life. People sang about the seasons, about lost loves, about strange dreams. If you listen closely to some of those early 15th century tunes, they sound wistful, even sleepy, like someone humming by the fire at the end of a long day. And maybe that's exactly what they were. Because after years of fear, people needed comfort. They needed stories, songs, laughter, and the warmth of others. In Italy, poets like Boccaccio wrote tales about love and wit and foolishness. The Decameron, for instance, born directly out of the Black Death, full of people telling stories to pass the time while hiding from the plague. It's funny, it's human, and it's tired in the same way the whole world was tired. It's like everyone suddenly realized, we could die tomorrow, so we might as well tell a good story tonight. And that feeling, that bittersweet mix of joy and fatalism, spread far beyond Italy. In France, courtly romances took on a gentler tone. Knights and ladies were still falling in love, of course, but now the poems spoke more about loss, about the passing of time. Even chivalry, that proud medieval code, started to fade. There just weren't as many noble wars to fight, and besides, after watching entire villages vanish, heroism felt a bit hollow. Instead, people turned inward, toward books, toward art, toward reflection. You can picture a scribe somewhere in a monastery, copying a manuscript by lamplight, the scratch of his quill on parchment, the faint smell of ink and beeswax, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Outside, rain taps against the shutters. The world feels fragile, but still full of meaning. And as he works, he's part of something bigger, this slow, quiet preservation of knowledge. It's comforting, in a way, to know that even in times of collapse, someone was still sitting there, carefully writing down the stories of humankind, one sleepy line at a time. Meanwhile, over in the towns, merchants were growing richer than ever. Silk, wool, spices, all flowing again. The coins clinked louder, and the burghers, the middle class, started to flex their influence. They built big, square houses with glass windows. Imagine that, glass, and carved beams. They wore fine clothes and commissioned paintings of themselves and their families. Hands folded, eyes calm, looking straight at you from across the centuries. That's something new, too. Before, portraits were mostly for saints and kings. Now, regular people wanted to be remembered, their faces, their clothes, their dogs, even their favorite books. It's as if, after losing so many, people were determined not to vanish again. And those portraits, they're so still, so gentle. You can almost hear the hush of the painter's studio, the soft clink of brushes in a pot, the faint smell of linseed oil. the tick of distant church bells marking another hour. In all of this, the art, the songs, the rebuilding, there's one theme that never quite leaves: remembrance. The people of post-plague Europe lived with ghosts. Every field, every street, every empty cottage was a reminder of who wasn't there anymore. But instead of being swallowed by grief, they built around it. They made beauty out of memory. It's something humans have always done, quietly transforming pain into creation. So as the moon climbs higher above our imaginary medieval town, you can almost see those faint lights glowing in windows across the valley. One here, another there, scattered like stars on earth. Each light, a story. Each story a tiny act of defiance against the darkness. Tomorrow, we'll wander into those cities again, into Florence, Venice, Paris, where this slow awakening would begin to sparkle in earnest. A time when the plague's shadow faded just enough for art, science, and curiosity to bloom into something truly new. But for now, just listen to that silence between the bells. The world is healing, slowly, sleepily, beautifully. So, imagine we're walking again. It's early morning, the kind that feels soft and silvery, when fog still clings to the ground and every sound seems gentler somehow. The streets of Florence are waking up slow, like a sleepy cat stretching in a patch of sunlight. You hear the rattle of wooden shutters, the murmur of voices from a bakery, the low thud of a hammer from a nearby workshop. And beneath all that, there's this hum. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling. The hum of curiosity, of creation. The plague is a memory now, faint but never forgotten. And the people who survived, or whose parents survived, are no longer content just to live. They want to understand. Something remarkable begins here. In this century after the Black Death, a quiet explosion of thought, color, and human wonder that will later be called the Renaissance. Now, it's easy to think of the Renaissance as this dazzling burst of genius. Leonardo painting, Michelangelo sculpting, Galileo peering through a telescope. But really, it began with quieter people. Scholars hunched over old scrolls, merchants counting coins by candlelight, artists mixing pigments, experimenting with how light falls on skin. And it all began because the world had changed. Before the plague, most people believed the best way to understand life was through religion. The church explained everything: why you were born, why you died, why the sun rose. But when the plague swept through and spared no one, that certainty cracked. So people began looking elsewhere for answers, not in heaven, but here, on earth. That's what we call humanism. The belief that human beings, flawed, curious, creative, are worth studying, celebrating, and understanding. It sounds simple now, but back then, it was revolutionary. In the 1400s, in Italy's city-states, humanism spread like wildfire. Scholars rediscovered ancient texts, dusty manuscripts by Plato, Cicero, and Aristotle that had been forgotten for 1,000 years. They copied them, translated them, argued about them, and, most importantly, applied them. It wasn't about memorizing the past, it was about reviving it, about saying, maybe we can build something beautiful again. And so they did. Art changed first. Gone were the stiff saints floating in golden space. Now painters wanted realism, perspective, emotion, light. They wanted to capture the way the sun hit a brick wall at dusk, or how a smile curved just slightly. In Florence, a painter named Masaccio began to play with perspective, making walls and streets look like they actually receded into the distance. His frescoes were so real that people said they looked like windows into another world. Then came Botticelli, painting graceful figures like the birth of Venus, a goddess rising from the sea, pale and perfect, her hair curling like waves. It wasn't a religious painting, not really. It was about beauty for its own sake. And that idea that beauty was sacred too was new. Meanwhile, sculptors like Donatello began carving humans not as ideal saints but as, well, humans. You could see the tension in their muscles, the calm in their faces. They looked alive. Imagine walking into one of those workshops, the air thick with stone dust, the sound of chisels tapping rhythmically, the smell of sweat and marble, light slanting through the high windows, catching the floating dust motes like tiny stars. It would have felt like witnessing a miracle in slow motion, the rebirth of art, piece by piece. And behind much of it were the patrons, wealthy families, like the Medici of Florence. The plague had rearranged society, and the new merchant class had money to spend. They didn't have noble titles, but they had gold, and with gold came influence. They funded artists, poets, architects. They built chapels and libraries. It was partly pride, sure, but also something softer, a need to leave behind beauty in a world that had seen so much ugliness. That, too, was a gift of the plague, the understanding that life was fragile and precious, worth filling with color before it faded again. And it wasn't just Italy. Slowly, this energy drifted north, across the Alps, through France, into the Low Countries, into Germany, and finally, into England. Each place shaped it differently. In the Netherlands, artists like Jan van Eyck developed oil painting layer upon luminous layer. His portraits show faces so real you can almost hear the person breathe. You can see the texture of fur, the glint of gold thread, the shimmer of candlelight on glass. In Germany, thinkers like Johannes Gutenberg were tinkering with a strange machine, movable type, that would change everything. The printing press. Before Gutenberg, books were copied by hand, painfully slowly, by monks in cold scriptoria. But now, words could spread like never before. Knowledge was no longer trapped in monasteries. It belonged to anyone who could read. You can imagine the first time someone held a printed book. The smell of ink and paper, the sharp crack of the new binding, the neat black letters, all identical. It must have felt like magic, the kind of magic that doesn't vanish when you wake up. And what did people print first? Not novels, not gossip, but ideas, scientific treatises, ancient texts, religious debates. For the first time, knowledge moved faster than kings or priests could control it. That's the real legacy of the post-plague world, not just survival, but acceleration. All those losses had forced people to think differently, to look closer at life, to question, to invent. Even medicine began to change. Doctors started to doubt the old theories of bad air and humors. Some began dissecting human bodies quietly, secretly, because it was frowned upon. But they did it anyway. They wanted to see how the body really worked, not just read about it in ancient books. That curiosity led to discoveries about the heart, the lungs, the flow of blood. Tiny steps, yes, but each one built on the last, until modern medicine began to take shape. And if you step back and squint, you can see how all of it, art, science, philosophy, traces back to one shared emotion, the desire to make sense of a world that had once seemed senseless. The plague had shown everyone that life could vanish overnight, so why waste it? Why not paint, write, build, question, live while you can? That, my sleepy friend, might be the most human thought of all. Now picture this. It's a late evening in Florence, maybe around 1470. The streets are quiet. The air smells of warm stone and distant river water. In a small workshop, a young artist sits by candlelight, sketching a human hand, the way the fingers curve, the light pooling in the palm. His master dozes nearby, head tilted, brush still in hand. Outside, the city hums softly, full of dreams and ghosts. The plague's memory lingers like the faint echo of a bell. But above it all, life sings louder now. You can almost feel that energy, gentle but unstoppable, rising again. From death art, from fear, curiosity, from silence, music. And it's not done yet. Because as this new age of learning blossoms, it will also begin to question everything. The heavens, the earth, even the church itself. But for tonight, let's linger here a bit longer, under the Florentine stars, and listen to the slow, steady heartbeat of a world reborn. So, the candles of Florence are burning low, but far beyond those narrow Italian streets, the world is stirring again. It's the late 1400s now. The smell of ink and wet parchment hangs in the air of every scholar's room. The printing press hums quietly in the background, like rain tapping on a roof. And in taverns and workshops and universities, people are asking questions, dangerous ones, hopeful ones, questions that hadn't been asked for centuries. What is the world made of? What's beyond the ocean? Can we understand the heavens, not by prayer, but by reason? The great reshuffling that began after the Black Death didn't stop with the rebuilding of cities or the painting of ceilings. It became a habit, a restlessness. You see, when you live through something that breaks the world in half, you stop believing that anything is permanent. So people started to look beyond what they knew. Let's start with the skies. Up there, beyond the candle smoke, the stars glimmer like cold coins scattered across velvet. For centuries, people believed they moved in perfect, divine circles, the earth steady in the middle, unmoving. But not everyone was convinced. In a quiet study in Poland, a man named Nicolaus Copernicus was hunched over his papers, candlelight catching the edges of his notes. He was a churchman, but also a mathematician, and something in the old maps of the heavens didn't sit right with him. The planets didn't behave the way they were supposed to. Mars, for example, sometimes seemed to move backward in the sky, a strange looping dance that didn't fit the tidy, Earth-centered system. So Copernicus did something unthinkable. He put the sun in the center instead. It was such a simple idea, and yet it cracked the heavens open. He didn't publish it for years, not until 1543, near the end of his life, perhaps because he knew it would rattle the world. Imagine the courage it takes to look up at the stars and say, "I think we've been wrong for 1,000 years." And he wasn't alone. A century later, Galileo Galilei, that bright-eyed troublemaker from Pisa, picked up a telescope and looked closer. The night he first saw the moons of Jupiter must have been breathtaking. For tiny points of light, circling a distant planet, proof that not everything revolved around Earth. He saw mountains on the moon, spots on the sun, imperfections in what was supposed to be a flawless, heavenly realm. Each discovery whispered the same thing: the universe is bigger, stranger, and more alive than we thought. But with new knowledge came unease. The Church, still powerful, didn't like the idea of a moving Earth or a flawed sky. Galileo's telescope, for all its beauty, pointed toward trouble. Yet the world was already changing too fast to stop. Exploration had begun, bold, reckless, and sometimes cruel. In Portugal and Spain, sailors looked at the same stars as Copernicus, but they saw something different: opportunity. They stood on their creaking wooden ships, wind in their faces, the salty spray stinging their eyes. They dreamed of gold, spices, new lands, of glory. And so the age of exploration began, not with a single voyage, but with 1,000 small ones. Men like Prince Henry the Navigator sent fleets along the African coast, mapping, trading, learning the patterns of the sea. Then came Columbus, chasing the edges of the known world in 1492. He thought he'd found Asia. He'd actually stumbled into an entire hemisphere, a land teeming with people, languages, civilizations. What followed is hard to tell in a soothing tone, because history rarely stays gentle for long. The encounters that came after were filled with wonder, but also with violence and greed. The world was expanding, but not always kindly. Still, from a sleepy historian's view, you can almost imagine the feeling of standing on the deck of one of those ships, the air thick with salt, the creak of ropes, the endless blue of the ocean stretching into forever. To live in that time must have felt like standing at the edge of a map, staring into the unknown. And all of this, the voyages, the discoveries, the inventions, grew from the same seed the plague had planted: curiosity. Because once you've learned how fragile life can be, the unknown stops being something to fear. It becomes something to seek. Meanwhile, back on land, cities across Europe were transforming. London's streets buzzed with trade. Antwerp's docks glittered with cargo. The smell of fish, tar, and wet wool filled the air. Bells rang from church towers. Horses clattered across cobblestones. And in every corner of these cities, people were talking, arguing, learning. The printing press had filled Europe with books, thousands, then millions. Manuals on navigation, pamphlets on religion, guides to farming, plays, poetry. Ideas were contagious now, moving faster than any plague ever could. One of the most dangerous ideas came from a German monk named Martin Luther. He was tired of corruption, tired of the church selling forgiveness for coins. So one autumn day in 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. The sound of that hammer must have echoed like thunder. It sparked the Protestant Reformation, not just a religious movement, but a social earthquake. Suddenly, people began to think, what if we can talk to God directly? What if faith doesn't need priests, or Latin, or gilded cathedrals? The world was splintering again, not from plague this time, but from conviction. It's strange to think how it all ties back, like invisible threads, to the chaos of the 1300s. The plague broke the old structures. The centuries after rebuilt them, stronger, stranger, freer. And through it all, the rhythm of life kept going. Farmers still woke before dawn. Bells still rang for prayer. Candles still burned low in quiet homes. But underneath the familiar hum of daily life, there was this constant pulse of change, slow, steady, unstoppable. Now, as we move deeper into this post-plague world, Imagine sitting by a hearth somewhere in the 1500s. The fire pops softly, casting orange light across the stone floor. Someone's reading aloud from a freshly printed book, the ink still smelling faintly sharp. Outside, the night is clear, and the stars, those same stars Copernicus puzzled over, shimmer like distant secrets. The world is no longer still, it's breathing again. And in that breath lies everything that would come next: the Reformation, the voyages, the discoveries, the rise of reason, the hum of humanity, reborn from silence. So, centuries have passed since the bells tolled for the dead. The world that once lay shattered by the Black Death has become something almost unrecognizable. Imagine it's the early 1600s. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and candle wax. In a quiet room somewhere in England, a man named Francis Bacon is sitting by a flickering fire, scratching notes into a journal. His quill squeaks faintly against the parchment. He writes about knowledge, how it shouldn't come from books alone, or from ancient authorities, but from observation, from looking, from testing. Knowledge is power, he says, and he means it quite literally, because this is the beginning of something new, something we now call the scientific revolution. The curiosity that had sparked in the wake of the Black Death had never died out. It had grown, layer by layer, into a habit, the habit of asking why. In those centuries after the plague, people had already rediscovered the wisdom of the ancients. Now they wanted to go further. They wanted to understand not just what the world was, but how it worked. You can picture it: scholars peering through early microscopes, astronomers charting the skies, alchemists in smoky cellars heating glass vials over small blue flames, and in that swirl of candlelight and ink, the very foundations of reality began to shift. Galileo, who once stared through his telescope at the moons of Jupiter, was still testing the limits of what could be known. Kepler found patterns in the movements of the planets, not perfect circles, but elegant ellipses. And then, in 1687, a quiet man from England dropped an apple, or at least imagined it falling, and saw in that simple motion the truth of the universe. Isaac Newton. He didn't invent gravity, of course. He just gave it a name. But by doing so, he stitched the heavens and the earth back together, the apple and the moon, bound by the same invisible thread. It's funny, in a way. For centuries, people had looked at the stars and seen divine perfection. Now they looked and saw physics, but it wasn't cold. There was still beauty in it, a beauty made of numbers and motion, of order hidden within chaos. The world felt larger now, but also clearer, and that clarity began to seep into every corner of life. Medicine, for instance, was changing, slowly but surely. The old medieval theories, humors, leeches, bad air, began to crumble. Doctors started experimenting, observing, dissecting, writing it all down. In 1628, an Englishman named William Harvey discovered how blood actually moved through the body. For the first time, people understood the heart, not as a vessel for emotion, but as a pump, steady, mechanical, miraculous in its rhythm. And yet, life for most people was still simple, still slow. If you walked through a small village in France or England or Germany around this time, you'd still hear the familiar sounds, the soft bleating of sheep, the clatter of wooden wheels, the echo of church bells rolling across fields. The plague still flared up from time to time, little reminders of the old terror, but never again like before. The people who lived in those centuries had inherited the memory of it. Even generations later, the fear lingered in their bones. It showed in their art, their prayers, their stories. But alongside that fear, there was a new kind of courage, the quiet confidence of survivors. And from that confidence, something else began to bloom, the belief that the human mind could shape the world. That belief would eventually become the Enlightenment. Now, enlightenment sounds dramatic, like a flash of light, a sudden awakening. But really, it was more like dawn breaking very slowly across Europe. In coffeehouses and drawing rooms, people gathered to talk about science, about reason, about freedom. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, mingled with pipe smoke and the rustle of papers. Men and women alike, philosophers, poets, merchants, even tailors, debated everything from government to the soul. And always, beneath the chatter, there was this soft hum of optimism. The idea that the darkness, ignorance, superstition, fear could be pushed back, not by faith alone, but by thought. Voltaire wrote sharp, witty letters. Rousseau dreamed of simpler lives. Diderot gathered knowledge into one great encyclopedia, a collection of everything humans knew, written not in Latin, but in the language of ordinary people. Knowledge, once locked away in monasteries, now spilled into the streets. Imagine walking through Paris around 1750, the narrow lanes glowing with lamplight, the air thick with the smell of bread and ink. You pass a printing shop, and in the window are pamphlets, bold titles, scandalous ideas, new words about liberty and reason. Something electric is happening, but quietly, no shouting, no banners, just conversations, pen scratches, cups of coffee cooling beside half-finished essays. And all this thinking, debating, arguing, still traces back to that one great silence centuries ago, when the world was forced to stop and start again. The plague had stripped humanity bare, and what came afterward was a rebuilding not just of bodies and cities, but of the human mind. By now, Europe was unrecognizable. The great cathedrals of the Middle Ages still stood, but beside them rose new buildings, museums, academies, libraries. The air buzzed with invention. Ships crossed oceans with growing ease. Telescopes reached deeper into the sky. Instruments measured the invisible air pressure, magnetism, electricity. The world was being mapped, charted, weighed, and yet it still felt full of mystery. And here's something lovely. Even as science marched forward, people didn't lose their sense of wonder. If anything, they gained a new one, the wonder of understanding. To look at lightning and think, that's electricity, but still feel it spark through your bones. To see a falling apple and feel connected to the moon. To peer through a microscope and find a hidden universe in a drop of water. It was the same old awe, just with different words. And while all this unfolded among thinkers and philosophers, everyday life was changing too. Slowly, softly, like the turning of a season. The houses grew sturdier, the markets busier, the streets a little cleaner, though still muddy and loud. Children went to school more often. Farmers used new tools. Sailors carried stories from faraway lands. The world that had once seemed cruel and uncertain began to feel, if not safe, at least possible. People still prayed, still feared, still loved and grieved, but more and more, they believed they could shape their future. And in that belief, quiet, cautious, but steady, you can hear the echo of those who had once survived the worst, and said, "We can build again." Outside, in the faint candlelight of the 1700s, the night is calm. Somewhere, a clock ticks softly, measuring time in tiny, perfect beats. The hum of conversation fades into silence. A philosopher blows out his candle, the last curl of smoke rising into the dark. The world sleeps, but it's a different kind of sleep now, not the sleep of despair, but of possibility. And in the distance, you can almost hear it, the faint rumble of a new age approaching, made of steam and iron, of engines and factories. The next great transformation, waiting just beyond the horizon. So, the world has been reborn again, not with cathedrals or frescoes this time, but with iron and fire. It's the late 1700s now, and something strange and unstoppable is beginning to stir. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, a distant clank of metal, the hiss of steam, the low hum of engines, turning somewhere in the dark. The air smells different too, not just of wood smoke anymore, but of coal and oil, of industry. This is the Industrial Revolution, though no one calls it that yet. To the people living through it, it's just change, the kind of change you can feel under your feet, the ground itself trembling softly with progress. And, like so much else, this transformation, too, traces its roots back to those long centuries after the plague. The survivors had rebuilt their world through work, invention, and an almost stubborn kind of hope. Now, all that human energy, curiosity, ambition, ingenuity, was coming to a boil. Picture this: England in the 18th century, rolling green hills dotted with new towns, canals slicing through the countryside like silver ribbons, the sound of hammering, always hammering on ships, on rails, on machines no one's ever seen before. In a workshop in Birmingham, James Watt leans over a strange contraption, a steam engine, hissing softly. He wipes his brow, adjusts a valve, listens. It works. For the first time, steam power is not just a novelty, it's reliable. And with that single moment, the rhythm of the world changes forever. Because now, power no longer comes from the wind or the water or the muscle of men and horses. It comes from steam, invisible, relentless, tireless. It's the sound of progress, breathing. You can almost imagine what it felt like to walk through one of those early factories. The air, hot and metallic. The rhythmic thud of pistons, sparks flying like fireflies in the dim light. Men shouting over the roar. Women and children moving between machines with practiced ease. Outside, the city hums, carts rattling, chimneys puffing, trains screeching in the distance. The nights glow faintly orange from the furnaces, and even the stars seem dimmer now, hidden behind the new smoke of industry. But there's something strangely beautiful in it, to a kind of human heartbeat, magnified 1,000 times. The same hands that once rebuilt villages after the plague are now building engines, bridges, locomotives. The same drive to survive has become a drive to improve, and life, for better or worse, speeds up. Goods move faster. Letters travel by train. Cities swell with workers. The world that once took centuries to change now shifts in a single generation. People who once measured time by the sun or the seasons now live by the clock. The tick, tick, tick of precision, each second counted, each hour filled. And yet, even as everything grows louder, dirtier, faster, there's a quiet truth at the heart of it all. This, too, is a kind of rebirth. The Black Death had taught humanity how to begin again from ashes. The Industrial Age was another beginning, not born from loss, but from memory. Factories rise where plague pits once lay. Libraries and schools appear in towns that had once been ghostly and empty. Steamships carry not just goods, but people, migrants, dreamers, thinkers, to new worlds. And with that movement comes new connections. A farmer in Yorkshire can now read news from London in a day. A merchant in Liverpool can trade with a stranger across the ocean. A weaver's child might grow up to be an engineer. The rigid old hierarchies, the ones that had already cracked after the plague, are breaking apart completely now. The world is becoming less certain, but also more open. Still, not everything feels bright. For many, the new factories are prisons of smoke and sweat. The air inside is thick and sour. The hours are long. Children cough in the shadows of machines that never sleep. But even there, even in those dark, clattering halls, you can feel something stirring. A growing awareness that life could be better. People start to talk about rights, about fairness, about dignity. Unions form. Writers describe the conditions of the poor. Artists paint the faces of workers with the same care once reserved for saints. It's another echo of that old lesson that suffering can spark change. And while the factories roar, the world outside them keeps expanding. Across oceans, explorers map coastlines, chart rivers, and sketch mountains that no European had ever seen. Ships cross the Atlantic and the Pacific. Telegraph wires stretch like spiderwebs across continents, carrying messages faster than wind or horse could ever go. The world that once seemed endless is shrinking now, connected by iron, ink, and imagination. And yet, in small corners, people still remember the old rhythms. In villages untouched by railroads, you can still hear the clatter of a handloom, the soft rustle of wheat, the quiet hush of evenings that haven't yet learned to hurry. Somewhere, a grandmother still tells stories by the fire, stories of the great pestilence, passed down through centuries, half history, half myth. Once, she says softly, the world ended, but it began again. Her voice is gentle, and her listeners' children wide-eyed. In the glow of the hearth, can T imagine such darkness? But they remember the words. They always do. And when they grow older, when they see smoke rising from the new factories and hear the clatter of machines, they understand the world is always ending and always beginning again. By now, it's late. The streets of London, or Manchester, or Paris, shimmer faintly under gaslight. Horses clop through puddles, their hooves echoing softly. The sky glows faintly from factory fires, but above it all, the stars are still there, distant and quiet. Someone walks home from work, soot on their hands, a faint smile on their face. The city may be noisy, but life goes on, stubborn, resilient, endlessly curious. The same human spark that once rebuilt the world after plague now fuels this new, unstoppable age. And soon, not yet, but soon that spark will light something even bigger. Revolutions, empires, science that reaches for the stars. But for tonight, let's just rest here, in this moment, among the chimneys and cobblestones, the quiet pride of builders and dreamers, the distant hum of progress whispering beneath the fog. The world now hums with motion. The 19th century stretches before us, a long road paved with invention, war, and wonder. The factories are louder, the cities bigger. Trains whistle across the countryside, cutting through fields that once belonged to medieval farmers. Steamships leave ports heavy with cargo and dreams. The smell of coal clings to everything, even the morning fog. If you walk through London around this time, you'd feel it, that mix of excitement and exhaustion. The cobblestones glisten with rain and soot. The air hums with the sound of wheels, hooves, shouts. The old medieval walls are long gone, swallowed by endless rows of houses, shops, and chimneys. But beneath all that noise, there's still a kind of quiet progress, not of machines, but of minds. After centuries of fear and superstition, people are starting to understand sickness. They no longer whisper that plague is God's punishment or the devil's breath. Instead, doctors begin to look closer, with microscopes, with curiosity, with courage. In tiny labs filled with glass tubes and the faint smell of alcohol, scientists peer into droplets of blood, slivers of tissue, and discover a hidden world, teeming with life too small to see. It's unsettling, in a way, the thought that everything, even air and water, could be alive with invisible creatures. But it's also liberating, because if disease has a cause, maybe it can have a cure. And one of those minds, steady, thoughtful, curious, belongs to a Frenchman named Louis Pasteur. He watches milk spoil, wine turn sour, and wonders why. Eventually he finds the answer. Germs, tiny organisms that move unseen, causing sickness and decay. He learns to kill them with heat, pasteurization, they call it. And soon, his work helps make medicine more precise, more hopeful. Around the same time, Robert Koch, a quiet German doctor, isolates the bacteria that caused tuberculosis and cholera. These men, and others like them, are writing the final chapters of a story that began in the dark streets of the 14th century, when people carried posies and prayed to keep death away. Now, at last, they can see the enemy, and that changes everything. Hospitals become cleaner. Doctors wash their hands, sterilize their tools. Nurses, inspired by Florence Nightingale's quiet revolution, bring order and compassion into places that once felt like despair. It's not perfect, medicine never is, but for the first time, humanity is not just surviving disease, it's learning to fight back. And the old ghost of the Black Death, though it still haunts Europe in small outbreaks, begins to fade into memory. People still talk about it, of course. It's the kind of story that never truly disappears, but now it's spoken of with distance, as something that happened long ago, like a storm that has finally passed. Even art changes. Painters turn from saints and sinners to sunlight and faces. Writers talk of love, progress, and society. The world, once obsessed with death, becomes fascinated by life, how it works, how it grows, how it might last. There's something almost poetic in that turn. You can imagine an old scholar, sitting by candlelight in 1850, opening a dusty chronicle and reading about the plague years. He sighs, adjusts his glasses, and writes in the margin, "We have learned much since then." But of course, the past doesn't vanish so easily. It lingers in habits and fears. Even now, in the bustling markets and grand drawing rooms, you can still find traces of medieval caution. The boiled water, the herbal sachets, the way mothers shush their children not to play near the gutters. And when a sickness does return, as it sometimes does, people remember. In the 19th century, cholera sweeps through Europe, and old fears wake up again. The stench of unclean water, the panic in the streets, the hurried prayers. But this time, the response is different. Governments act, cities dig sewers, build aqueducts, clear the slums. It's not just about survival anymore, it's about prevention. A new word, really, for an old wish. The wish to not live in fear. And as the century moves forward, that wish grows stronger. The human population, which had shrunk so terribly after the Black Death, now swells to numbers unimaginable in the Middle Ages. Villages become towns, towns become cities, and cities become sprawling centers of steel and glass. There's a kind of fragile pride in it all, as if humanity has finally outsmarted its old enemy. But sometimes, on quiet nights, the memory returns. An old bell in a country church tolls for a funeral, and the villagers fall silent. Somewhere, a historian reads an ancient record of 1348 and feels a chill. The words are simple. Many died, and few were left to bury them, but they still have power. Because everyone, deep down, knows what it means to lose and rebuild. And maybe that's the most human thing of all, the ability to keep moving forward even after everything stops. The world of the 19th century is vast and strange. Gaslights glow in the fog, steam trains whistle in the night, empires stretch across continents. There's a sense that anything is possible, and yet, beneath it all, the same old questions hum quietly. What does it mean to live well, to be safe, to be remembered? People begin to look back, not with fear now, but with curiosity. Archaeologists dig up medieval plague pits, carefully brushing away soil to reveal old bones. Scientists study the preserved remains, trying to understand how something so small could have undone a world. And the answers, slow, patient, meticulous, shape the medicine and the mindset of the modern age. It's strange, isn't it, how even horror can leave behind wisdom, how something that once brought silence to entire continents could later whisper lessons about hygiene, compassion, and resilience. The Black Death didn't just change how people lived, it changed how they thought. It made them question everything: the church, the body, the soul, the stars, the rules. And in questioning, they learned to see more clearly. That quiet ripple from the 14th century had now reached every shore, from the microscope lens to the poet's pen, from the doctor's glove to the city sewer, and the world was cleaner, smarter, kinder, because of it. Not perfect, never perfect, but alive, and learning, always learning. Outside, the century draws to a close. Electric lights begin to flicker in windows where candles once burned. The world hums not just with machines, but with ideas. Somewhere, a telegraph clicks out a message, a train shrieks in the distance. A man in a white coat peers through a microscope and smiles faintly. He's seen something beautiful, and if you close your eyes now, you might almost hear the heartbeat of history itself, slow, steady, relentless, reminding us that even from plague, beauty can bloom. So, it's the early 1900s now. The world hums with engines and electricity. The streets are crowded, yet quieter than you might think, because people are beginning to live in ways that the medieval villagers could never imagine. Steamships cross oceans in days instead of months. Railways stretch like veins across continents. The air smells faintly of coal, gasoline, and wet pavement. There's a crispness to it, like the world has taken a deep, steadying breath. And medicine has advanced enough to make a difference most people could only dream of a few centuries earlier. Doctors no longer whisper about plague with fear. They know what causes it. They can isolate it, study it, and in some cases, prevent it. Vaccines are being developed, antibiotics are on the horizon, and hospitals are becoming places of healing instead of places of despair. You can imagine a small clinic somewhere in Europe. The walls are whitewashed, the floors swept clean. A nurse gently ties a bandage around a child's arm, while outside, the soft hum of an early automobile drifts through the cobbled street. The smell of antiseptic mingles with the faint aroma of bread baking in a nearby bakery. And the people, they are healthier, stronger, and more resilient. The shadow of the Black Death is finally fading, though it still lingers in old stories, chronicles, and the careful habits of hygiene passed down through generations. And yet, even in this time of progress, the world has its own quiet tragedies. The Spanish flu sweeps through in 1918, reminding everyone that disease is never truly gone. Streets empty, funerals are held in silence, and homes are filled with the low hum of mourning. The memory of plague lives on in these moments, whispered in candlelit rooms and faint coughs. But there's something new now, a sense of understanding. Scientists study viruses, track infections, and teach the public how to protect themselves. Knowledge, once hidden in monasteries or dusty manuscripts, flows freely. Newspapers, radios, and telegrams carry warnings, advice, and sometimes hope. The world is connected now, more than ever. And in that connection, there is power. The mistakes of the past centuries of helplessness during the Black Death are remembered, but they are no longer inescapable. Meanwhile, daily life continues with a quiet beauty of its own. Families stroll through parks lit by electric lamps. Children chase each other along paved streets. Shops hum softly with the sound of commerce. The smell of coal and rain mixes with flowers in carefully tended gardens. In small towns, people still light candles in memory of those who passed long ago. In museums, skeletons of plague victims sit quietly behind glass, teaching future generations about resilience, survival, and the fragility of life. the arts, too, continue to flourish. Painters and writers capture both the joy and sorrow of modern life: electric trams, bustling city streets, and quiet countryside. Music drifts from open windows, a piano in a parlor, a violin on a street corner, the faint hiss of a gramophone recording. It is, in a way, a continuation of what began centuries ago: the human desire to create, to understand, to leave something behind that never died. The Black Death had taken lives, yes, but it had also forced humanity to look, think, and rebuild. And that habit of curiosity and perseverance now flows through the veins of this modern world. Across continents, nations begin to establish public health systems. Quarantines, sanitation, and vaccination programs slowly take the sting out of epidemics. Cities grow, but not carelessly. Planners build sewage systems, clean water supplies, and hospitals. And so, finally, the plague ceases to dominate daily life. Its shadow remains in history books, in museum displays, in the whispered stories of old families, but it no longer dictates the rhythms of towns or the fears of everyday people. Even in the quietest moments, a nurse tucking a child into bed, a baker sweeping flour from the floor, a scholar reading by lamplight, the legacy of survival whispers softly: we endured, we rebuilt, we remembered, and we learned. And in learning, humanity slowly becomes capable of facing not just disease, but every challenge that life might throw its way. From the soot-filled streets of Victorian London to the electric-lit avenues of New York, Paris, and Berlin, life moved steadily forward. People walk, talk, laugh, and plan. The world hums alive, curious, resilient. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the rhythm of centuries: the tolling bells of medieval villages, the whispered prayers during plague years, the scratch of quills, the hiss of steam engines, the click of telegraphs, and the soft hum of radios, all blending into one long, gentle heartbeat. A heartbeat that says, life goes on, life endures. And from the shadows of even the darkest moments, the world slowly learns to shine again. Outside, the night is calm. Stars twinkle above electric city lights. Somewhere, a clock ticks quietly. Someone exhales, relieved that the old terror has passed. And though humanity knows that danger can always return, the lesson of the Black Death remains, that even from devastation, courage, knowledge, and hope can grow. The world sleeps tonight, a little wiser, a little steadier, a little more gentle. So, the 20th century hums with the sound of change. It's quieter in some ways. The cities no longer choke on coal. The streets are paved, and lights blink gently where fires once glowed. But the world is moving faster, reaching further, thinking deeper than ever before. Medicine, once limited to observation and hope, now stretches into the impossible. Vaccines for smallpox, diphtheria, and polio save millions of lives. Doctors no longer guess, they know. They test, they study, they prevent. The memory of plague lingers, yes, but now it serves as a guide, not a shadow. Imagine a quiet hospital ward in the 1950s. The air smells faintly of antiseptic and flowers brought by visitors. Nurses move softly between beds, checking pulses, adjusting blankets. Outside, a soft breeze rustles through leafy trees. Children laugh somewhere in the courtyard. And somewhere in a laboratory, scientists peer into microscopes, studying bacteria, viruses, and cells. Their hands are steady, their eyes bright with curiosity. They remember centuries of struggle, of mistakes, of losses, and they work to prevent them from happening again. Meanwhile, the world has grown smaller. Airplanes carry people across oceans in hours, not months. Telephones, and later radios and televisions, carry voices, music, and news across continents. Ideas from art to science to medicine spread faster than ever. And yet, despite all the speed, humanity has learned the value of slow, careful observation. Epidemiologists study outbreaks, track patterns, and teach communities how to protect themselves. Quarantine is no longer superstition, it's science. Masks, vaccines, sanitation, tools of knowledge, not fear. And the old lessons of resilience remain. You can see it in the rebuilding after wars, the recovery from famines, the response to epidemics. Every challenge is faced with a mixture of caution, hope, and ingenuity. Echoes of centuries of learning, beginning with the long shadow of the Black Death. Even in ordinary life, the influence of that distant plague lingers softly. Hand washing, Public health awareness, vaccination campaigns, small routines that save lives, are quiet tributes to the lessons learned long ago. And while cities buzz, people continue the timeless rhythms of living. Children play in parks, families gather around dinner tables, elders tell stories of past hardships. The world, though modern, carries with it the whispers of history. Art and culture continue to evolve as well. Painters, writers, filmmakers, and musicians explore both joy and sorrow, often inspired by human endurance. Literature recalls the plague subtly, as metaphor or memory, while museums preserve its traces, garments, documents, and skeletal remains as reminders of fragility and survival. And science marches on. Antibiotics combat infections, once deadly. Public health measures prevent outbreaks. Doctors, nurses, and researchers work together in a global network that would have been unimaginable in the 14th century. The Black Death is no longer a daily terror, but its echo shapes the choices of humanity. The careful study of disease, the compassion of caregivers, the drive to understand life itself, all of this can be traced back, quietly, to that catastrophic event centuries earlier. And if you wander through the quiet streets at night, you can almost sense it, the rhythm of human persistence, the soft pulse of curiosity and care, the gentle whisper that even after devastation, life endures. Somewhere, a clock ticks in a small apartment, a parent tucks a child into bed, gently smoothing their blanket. Outside, the hum of traffic mixes with the distant song of crickets. Somewhere else, a scientist carefully pours a liquid into a test tube, observing, noting, learning, and all of it, the laughter, the labor, the observation, is part of the same thread. The thread that connects a 14th century villager fleeing the plague, to a Renaissance painter, to a 19th century factory worker, to a 20th century doctor watching a microscope. The world has changed, of course, faster, louder, brighter, but the quiet lessons remain. Care, observation, learning, and the stubborn will to live. And somewhere in the night, if you listen closely, you can hear history breathing softly, a long, steady rhythm, reminding us that even after the darkest chapters, life goes on, gently, persistently, beautifully. The night is calm. Cities glow softly with electric lights. Somewhere, a plane hums quietly overhead. Children sleep. Streets empty. Hospitals glow faintly with care. The lessons of the Black Death, centuries old, have been woven into every corner of modern life, like a faint, comforting melody. And though the world will always face disease, suffering, and uncertainty, humanity moves forward with the wisdom of history behind it, resilient, curious, and unbroken. So, the world moves forward, carrying the weight of centuries. The late 1900s hum with electricity, engines, and conversations that span oceans instantly. And yet, the lessons of long ago remain quietly embedded in the way people live, think, and care for one another. Hospitals now are bright, clean, and efficient. The air smells faintly of disinfectant and flowers from a visitor's bouquet. Machines beep softly in rhythm with life itself. Nurses walk with quiet confidence. Doctors consult screens, charts, and monitors. Knowledge flows faster than fear, and the long shadow of plague feels distant, yet still alive in memory. Vaccines prevent diseases that once decimated populations. Antibiotics fight infections that would have killed thousands. Public health campaigns teach hand-washing, sanitation, and hygiene. And when outbreaks occur, whether influenza, cholera, or something new, the world responds with science, coordination, and care. The shadow of the Black Death, though centuries old, quietly guides these efforts. Humanity remembers that fear, that helplessness, that fragile edge between life and death. And that memory shapes action, builds systems, and fosters resilience. And still, life continues. Children play under the soft glow of streetlights. Families gather for meals, sharing warmth and stories. Streets hum quietly with cars, bicycles, and the distant chatter of neighbors. Somewhere, a radio or television carries news of the wider world. Somewhere else, a scientist examines a virus under a microscope, inspired by curiosity and history alike. Art and literature continue to reflect humanity's triumphs and tragedies. Films, books, and paintings explore the fragility of life, the persistence of hope, the quiet rhythm of survival. Even in entertainment, the echoes of past suffering serve as reminders, subtle, persistent, comforting in their lessons. And as technology accelerates, so does awareness. Global communication allows humanity to respond more quickly than ever before. Health organizations track diseases worldwide. Vaccines are developed in months instead of years. Quarantine and prevention are no longer superstition, but strategy. Yet despite all the speed, the same human truths remain: empathy, patience, observation, and care. People still comfort the sick, teach the young, and remember the old. The lessons of the plague, to respect life, to prepare, to adapt, are quietly embedded in routines large and small. Even the simple act of washing one's hands, covering a cough, or keeping clean water flowing feels like a tribute to those who endured centuries ago. Ordinary people, simply living their lives, carry forward the wisdom of generations. And as we move into the 21st century, the world feels both immense and intimately connected. Aeroplanes hum overhead. Telephones and satellites relay voices and images across continents. Scientists collaborate globally. Communities share knowledge instantly. And yet, in quiet corners, a child tucked into bed, a nurse adjusting a blanket, an old journal on a library shelf, the memory of the past lingers. The Black Death taught humanity about fragility, loss, and despair. It also taught resilience, innovation, and the power of collective knowledge. That lesson whispers softly, guiding choices, shaping medicine, inspiring care, and reminding the world that life endures even in the face of catastrophe. Somewhere, in the calm of night, cities glow softly. Hospitals, homes, and schools are alive with quiet energy. And in that hum, you can almost hear centuries of history breathing together, a long, steady rhythm of survival and adaptation. And though humanity will always face disease, uncertainty, and loss, it faces them now armed with the wisdom of the past. The world has endured, learned, and rebuilt, from the streets, emptied by plague, to the laboratories, saving millions today. And as night deepens, the world sleeps, softly, steadily, confidently, carrying the lessons of centuries within its quiet, resilient heartbeat. So, the world steps into the 21st century. Cities glow with neon and LED lights. Trains, planes, and automobiles hum through streets and skies. People walk with devices in their hands, and information travels faster than ever before. And yet, even in this high-speed world, the lessons of the Black Death quietly whisper beneath it all. Then came a reminder, one that the world had not seen for over a century. In 2019, a virus emerged, invisible, silent, and relentless. It moved across the globe with ease, carried by air travel and human movement. Borders, once so solid, offered little protection. People remembered old fears, though this time, the panic was tempered with knowledge. Governments and scientists responded quickly, guided by centuries of experience. Labs identified the virus, hospitals adapted, public health campaigns taught masks, hygiene, and social distancing. Vaccines were developed at speeds once unimaginable, and the world watched, learned, adapted, just as it had learned after the Black Death, after cholera, after influenza. Yet, even with all that knowledge, life still slowed down. Streets emptied, shops closed. The air grew cleaner in cities once thick with exhaust. Families spent long hours together. Children played in quiet backyards. Neighbors waved across balconies. The world had to pause, and in that pause, it remembered itself. People read more. They cooked. They reflected. They checked in on one another. The rhythm of life changed, slowed, softened. Humanity was reminded of its fragility and of its incredible resilience. The sound of hospitals, the low hum of ventilators, the distant beeping of monitors filled the air like a heartbeat. Scientists worked quietly, sometimes for days without rest. The laboratories smelled of antiseptic, glass, and determination. And outside, streets once noisy with traffic were eerily silent. Yet, in this stillness, a familiar pattern emerged. Communities came together. Healthcare workers became heroes. Volunteers delivered food and medicine. And though fear lingered, hope persisted. History had taught humanity that survival depended on knowledge, preparation, and compassion. The Black Death had shown centuries ago what unchecked disease could do. Every strategy, every precaution, every act of care was a subtle echo of that old lesson. And as vaccines rolled out, and as cases gradually declined, the world breathed again. Streets filled slowly. Schools reopened. The hum of life returned. cars, buses, bicycles, laughter, conversation. Yet, unlike before, the memory of disease was now a guide, not a terror. The world understood the invisible threat, and it had the tools to fight it. Science, public health, and global cooperation became the shields against panic. In homes across the planet, life settled into a new rhythm. Children played in gardens, people read books by lamplight, elders shared stories of the past. Masks, sanitizers, and careful habits became part of daily life, quiet tributes to the lessons learned from centuries of struggle. And through it all, the heartbeat of humanity continued, slow, steady, resilient. The Black Death, long ago, had shown what could happen when the world was unprepared. Modern society, armed with memory, knowledge, and care, now faced challenges differently. And if you close your eyes tonight, you can almost hear it, the soft rhythm of centuries converging. Bells from medieval villages, the scratch of quills in Renaissance studies, the hiss of steam engines, the click of telegraphs, the hum of modern hospitals, all flowing into one steady heartbeat. A heartbeat that reminds us, life endures, humanity learns, and hope persists, even after the darkest times. Outside, the night is calm. Streets glow faintly under streetlights. Somewhere, a clock ticks softly. Children sleep, families rest, and the world breathes quietly, carrying the lessons of plague, survival, and perseverance into the future. And though challenges will always return, humanity now faces them with wisdom, compassion, and resilience. The same lessons passed down from centuries of history, softly shaping the rhythm of our modern lives. So, after all these centuries, the world has changed in ways unimaginable to those who first faced the Black Death. Cities are bright, hospitals clean, laboratories humming, and knowledge flows across continents in the blink of an eye. Yet, beneath all this modernity, the lessons of long ago remained quietly alive. The plague reshaped humanity not just through loss, but through adaptation, innovation, and reflection. Communities learned to care for one another, governments learned to act, scientists learned to observe, and everyday people, from peasants to scholars, learned to persevere. Imagine walking through a quiet museum today. The halls smell faintly of polished wood and old paper. Skeletons from plague pits sit behind glass, silent and still, their stories woven into history. Visitors move softly, some whispering, some simply gazing. There is a strange comfort in these displays, a reminder that humanity has endured, rebuilt, and learned. Art, too, carries the echo. Paintings, literature, even music, reflect resilience as much as suffering. The quiet beauty of life, the joy found in simple moments, the fleeting tenderness of a hand held or a candle lit, these themes persist, quietly honoring those who lived, who survived, and who rebuilt. Medicine, shaped by centuries of trial and observation, has grown into a vast, intricate network. Vaccines, antibiotics, sanitation, and public health systems form shields against diseases that would once have been devastating. And yet, doctors and nurses still carry the same courage, care, and diligence as their predecessors. The faint hum of a hospital at night is a rhythm as old as survival itself. And the world continues to learn. Every outbreak, every pandemic, every challenge is a reminder of what came before, and an opportunity to apply the knowledge of the past. Humanity has become a little wiser, a little more careful, a little more compassionate. Even the smallest gestures, washing hands, preparing clean water, caring for the sick, are echoes of lessons learned centuries ago. They are quiet threads connecting a medieval village, a Renaissance scholar, a 19th century doctor, and a 21st century scientist. The Black Death also reshaped society itself. Labor became more valuable, ideas spread more freely, and human curiosity flourished. Cities, economies, art, science, all bear the subtle imprint of a world that had once been nearly emptied, then rebuilt from the ashes. And as night falls across this modern world, the same rhythm continues. Streetlights glow softly. Families gather at home. Scholars study quietly. Somewhere, a child drifts to sleep with a story of history whispered gently in their ear. History, in all its depth, is not just a record of death or fear, but of resilience, adaptation, and hope. Every generation inherits the lessons of the past, learning to survive and thrive. And if you pause and listen closely, you can almost hear it, the soft heartbeat of humanity, steady across the centuries. From the dark streets of 14th century Europe to the glowing hospitals of today, from handwritten chronicles to digital databases, that heartbeat whispers the same thing. Life endures, humanity persists, and knowledge is our shield. And as the world sleeps tonight, the quiet hum of survival continues, gentle, patient, unwavering, reminding us that even after the darkest hours, light always returns. Outside, the night is peaceful. Windows glow faintly, trees sway softly, and the distant hum of life continues. Humanity rests, but it is awake to the lessons of the past, carrying them quietly forward into tomorrow. The Black Death may have shaped history with terror, but its lasting legacy is far gentler: resilience, wisdom, and the quiet, persistent hope that life in all its fragile beauty continues. Now, as we reach the very end of our long journey through history, let's take a moment to breathe slowly, to feel the calm of the world as it rests after centuries of struggle, survival, and renewal. The Black Death came long ago, like a shadow sweeping across villages, towns, and cities. It took lives, reshaped societies, and left an echo that lasted for centuries. But if we listen carefully, we realize that its story is not only about loss, it is also about endurance, wisdom, and the quiet strength of humanity. Imagine a quiet evening. A soft breeze moves through the streets of a modern city. Windows glow gently. Somewhere, a child falls asleep under a warm blanket. Somewhere else, a scholar reads by lamplight. Somewhere, a doctor quietly tends to a patient, or a nurse smooths a blanket over a tired body. Every one of these moments, ordinary and small, carries the lessons of the past: care, patience, observation, empathy, values that grew slowly from centuries of challenge. They traced their roots back to the people who rebuilt after the plague, who walked through devastation and whispered, "We will endure." Even the rhythm of life itself, the heartbeat of cities, the rustle of leaves, the soft hum of daily work, feels like a continuation of history. The air smells faintly of evening rain, of warm homes, of earth and wood and quiet streets. Light glows softly in windows. Somewhere, someone hums a tune long forgotten, yet comforting. We can almost hear it, the gentle pulse of humanity, steady across centuries. From the medieval villager clutching a posy to keep death away, to the Renaissance thinker sketching stars and moons, to the industrial worker leaning over a glowing furnace, to the modern doctor peering through a microscope, all connected by one invisible thread, a thread of survival, curiosity, hope, and care. The Black Death taught fear, yes, but also the value of community, knowledge, and resilience. It taught that life can be fragile, but that human spirit is enduring. And through every century since, we have carried those lessons quietly, woven into the fabric of our homes, our cities, our science, and our stories. And now, as the night deepens, the world sleeps peacefully. Streets are still. Cities glow softly under the gentle sweep of stars. Somewhere, the faint ticking of a clock reminds us of time's slow, patient passage. And in that quiet, we can feel history breathing, slow, steady, comforting. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember this: humanity has endured great darkness, but it has always rebuilt. We have learned to care, to observe, to understand, and to hope. And even when challenges arise, the lessons of centuries guide us, softly, gently, reliably. Life continues, quietly, beautifully, and history long, winding, sometimes tragic, always persistent, carries us forward into every new day. We guys, and with that, let the world rest. Let your thoughts drift, soft and slow, like candlelight flickering in a quiet room. The past whispers gently, the present hums softly, and the future waits patiently. Sleep well, knowing that humanity, like you, endures.